The Battle of Berlin is undoubtedly one of the best known and most emblematic of the entire Second World War. It marked the end of the fighting in Europe, and during the course of it, Adolf Hitler decided to take his own life rather than surrender. But there was a previous conflict that, despite its importance, is often overlooked. This was the Oder-Neisse Offensive, in which the fate of the German capital would be decided. Millions of Soviet soldiers faced a demoralized German defense, greatly inferior in number. Despite this, if Joseph Stalin's men thought that their victory was assured, they were faced with the reality that the Germans were not yet completely defeated. The Führer's orders were clear. They had to fight until the last drop of blood. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the Battle of Oder-Neisse. Some historians mark the beginning of the road to Berlin in a battle that took place almost 3,000 kilometers away from the German capital. In July 1942, the Nazis reached the gates of Stalingrad in the south of the Soviet Union. This city was their next objective after the previous conquests. Places of great importance such as Smolensk and Sevastopol had fallen into German hands, bringing with them the death of hundreds of thousands of men of the Soviet Union. Everything seemed to indicate that, as had happened in those battles, they would have no problems in winning a new fight against the rickety Red Army. For Hitler, taking the city that bore the name of the enemy leader would be a victory not only tactical, but symbolic, which would bring him closer to total domination. But Stalin and his generals were also aware of this, and that is why they decided that it would not fall into Nazi hands under any circumstances. Order 227 was issued, which declared that not one step back would be taken. Anyone who deserted his post would be shot by his superiors. But rather than increasing the soldiers' resentment against their officers, it motivated them to defend their homeland to the death. Thanks to the courage and sacrifice of the Soviet fighters, Stalingrad held out for months, much longer than the Führer had expected. In addition, the invaders had to face the terrible Russian winter, with temperatures reaching 40 degrees below zero. The death toll on the German side was in the tens of thousands. Food and medicine were scarce, while disease was spreading rapidly. The Soviets took advantage of this situation to reinforce the areas around Stalingrad, preparing for an eventual offensive that would liberate the place. Although his generals advised him to retreat to reorganize the attack, for Hitler, the capture of the city had become a matter of personal pride.
Hitler is acutely aware of the symbolism of Stalingrad as a symbol of Stalin himself and as a symbol of new Soviet man and Soviet industry. Hitler just wants to go for Stalingrad because it's Stalingrad.
Like Stalin, Hitler gave the order that retreat was completely forbidden. But unlike what happened with the communist forces, the effect was not at all motivating. Completely surrounded, constantly suffering from hypothermia and starvation, this ended up cementing the final fate of the Nazi forces. In early 1943, the entire German army was surrounded in the snowy Soviet steppes outside the city, and its general had no choice but to sign the surrender. 91,000 soldiers were captured, and almost twice that number died in combat. The victory at Stalingrad raised the morale of the people and soldiers of the communist country and gave them enough energy to launch their massive counterattack. Quite the opposite happened with the Germans, who saw how the myth of their supposed invincibility bled into the snow along with their men. In the following months, the Soviets advanced with terrible fury against their enemies, reaping more victories than defeats. The Germans, who had also had to deal with setbacks in Africa and Italy, found themselves on the defensive for the first time in the war. And their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. By 1945, the Third Reich seemed to be on the ropes. Almost all of the territories they had conquered in the previous years had already been liberated. Their allies, including Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Italy, had already signed their surrender and in some cases even began to fight against them. Western powers such as the United States and England had landed on the French coast in 1944 and were advancing at a good pace towards the German heartland. By October of that year, they were already on Reich soil, with several towns and cities in their hands. German counteroffensives, such as that in the Ardennes, did not have the desired effect and could not prevent the American advance. But even so, the greatest danger for Hitler was on the Eastern Front. In the first days of 1945, the Soviet army was on Polish territory. The Baltic countries had been almost completely liberated, as had the area of East Prussia. But Joseph Stalin was faced with a dilemma. The leader was very suspicious of his Western allies. He believed that, after Germany was defeated, they would divide up the conquered territory in their favor, ignoring Soviet requests. To prevent this, instead of indicating a direct advance towards Berlin, the Russian leader ordered the launching of a large-scale offensive on a wide front. His idea was to take over as much area as possible so that it would not fall into English or American hands. Of course, his main objective was always the capture of the German capital. This city not only had enormous symbolic value, but was also where important resources were located. For example, part of the German research on the atomic bomb was located there. Of course, Hitler was also an important target. The German leader had moved to his headquarters in Berlin, attentive to the development of the last days of the war.
He really saw Berlin as the center of Nazi Germany. He saw capturing Berlin as a moment when the Soviet Union would quite literally physically overrun the Nazis, in much the same way that the Nazis believed that capturing Moscow would be the symbolic moment of the conquest of the Soviet Union.
The Soviet campaign that would eventually reach Berlin began on January 12th. On that day, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder Offensive. The goal was to finish retaking the territory of Poland, one of the few countries still under German control. In a little over 2 weeks, the Nazis were forced to abandon major cities such as Warsaw and Krakow. The concentration camps that lay along the way, for example Auschwitz, were also liberated, although the Germans continued to commit brutalities until the last moment. Death walks, where prisoners were forced to march hundreds of miles to another center, often without any shelter, were very common. Thousands died along the way, victims of cold, exhaustion, or gunfire from guards. By February, the Soviets crossed the banks of the Oder River. They were now officially in enemy territory. The war had reached Germany. At certain points, only 60 kilometers separated them from Berlin, so Hitler wanted to consolidate his defenses to protect the capital. He, however, believed that the Soviet attack would be directed at Hungary, since the Reich's last oil wells were located there. Although some of his generals protested, the leader directed several of his remaining forces to this front, taking them away from others. One of his most vocal detractors was Heinz Guderian, an expert in tank combat. He was able to convince the Führer to mount an attack where he thought the Russian offensive would be, on the banks of the Oder River, but this was not as successful. Nevertheless, it forced the Soviets to postpone their advance, seeing that the Germans were not as defeated as they thought. But the Germans did not take advantage of this pause to strengthen Berlin's defenses, since they believed that doing so would cause the citizens to panic. In addition, Hitler remained convinced that the capital was not Stalin's main objective. That was why the city's garrison, which was mostly made up of barely trained militia and members of the Hitler Youth, was not reinforced. According to several witnesses, the Führer was completely out of touch with German reality. He continued to seek to regain the initiative, when in truth he had lost it at Stalingrad 2 years earlier. Even though he received daily reports about Soviet movements on the banks of the Oder, he chose to ignore them. Almost none of his generals dared to contradict him, and the few who did risked being dismissed. Meanwhile, the leader demanded increasingly cruel directives, even from his own people. Among them was the Nero Order, which dictated that not 1 centimeter of fertile land should fall into enemy hands, burning it down if his men were forced to retreat. He also ruled that if a civilian waved a white flag, indicating his surrender, he should be executed as a traitor to the fatherland. In this way, he sought to get the entire German population to take part in the defense of the country.
Hitler decreed, quote, "Our nation's struggle for existence forces us to utilize all means, even within Reich territory, to weaken the fighting power of our enemy and to prevent further advances. Any opportunity to inflict lasting damage on the striking power of the enemy must be taken advantage of. It is a mistake to believe that undestroyed or only temporarily paralyzed traffic, communications, industrial, and supply installations will be useful to us again after the recapture of lost territories. During his retreat, the enemy will leave behind only scorched earth and will abandon all concern for the population."
Hitler made his decisions knowing that, unfortunately for him, the quality of his army was not at all the same as when he had started his campaign of conquest. His most experienced soldiers had been killed or captured on the various fronts where he fought. The majority of his forces were made up of old men or children, incapable of facing the millions of revenge-hungry Soviets. The training they received was not sufficient, and they functioned more as cannon fodder than as effective combat units. Several German counterattacks were attempted, but while some were able to slow the Soviet advance, they all failed in one fundamental matter. None produced such significant damage that it would prevent Stalin's troops from continuing to advance into Germany, liberating territories conquered by the Nazis in their path, such as Austria and the Czech Republic. By April 16th, the German collapse was imminent. Hitler and his most important advisors and generals were in an underground bunker inside Berlin, thinking about how to reverse their bad fortune. Meanwhile, Dwight Eisenhower, the general in charge of the Allied forces in Europe, contacted Stalin. He informed him that the objective of the Western units was Bavaria, in southeastern Germany, to prevent the Nazis from fleeing and regrouping in the mountains. The Soviet leader relaxed, knowing that his long-awaited prize would be his. He ordered his men to begin what would be the last offensive of the entire war in Europe. The Battle of the Oder-Neisse began, named after the rivers that ran near the German capital. German defenses had been set up along these two waterways, but as mentioned above, they were not in great shape. They were outnumbered by the Russians by a ratio of 10-1, and also had far fewer tanks, aircraft, and other vehicles. The first battles of this campaign occurred in the Silo Hills. Here the last fighting took place, of a pitched nature, unlike the urban fighting of the last days of the war. The Soviets started first, with a massive artillery barrage on the German positions. In just half an hour, 500,000 shells were fired. This was followed by the advance of the Red Army, which drove the Germans back. However, the marshy terrain in which the battle was taking place made progress slower than expected and made the Soviets easy prey for Nazi attacks. Because of this, Marshal Zhukov, in charge of the attack, had to confess to Stalin that the plans were not going as expected.
A belt of 88mm flak guns concealed along the foot of the Zelo heights took a heavy toll of the Soviet armor. Every bush and hedge on the heights concealed defensive positions, many of which had survived the bombardments that preceded various phases of the attack.
Although the number of casualties was high, reinforcements arrived the next day. To try to counter them, several German units stationed in Berlin were brought to the front, but they were unable to turn the situation around. The Soviets, thanks to their vast numerical superiority, were able to overwhelm the defenders. By the evening of the 17th, the Communists had managed to advance about 15 kilometers inland. Around Silo, things were even worse for the locals. To the south, the 1st Ukrainian Front was dueling with soldiers of the German Army Group Center in what became known as the Cottbus-Potsdam Offensive. The latter's forces were even more weakened, and they were barely able to hold out for a day before being overwhelmed. German General Ferdinand Schörner had 2 armored units in reserve, but he did not decide to use them to strengthen his defense. This proved to be a serious mistake. By the evening of that day, their positions were becoming untenable, and they had to retreat to avoid being encircled. On this flank, the first encounter between Soviet and American troops of the war also took place. The two forces met near the town of Torgau, or Thurgau. Together, they destroyed the Führer Escort Brigade, an armored unit tasked with protecting Hitler. Men from both countries continued to fight together until the end of the war. Until April 19th, fighting continued at Silo and in the surrounding areas. Although thousands of communist soldiers fell to German gunfire or artillery, they had more than 1 million men. If one died, he was quickly replaced by another. That night, the Soviets reached the last German defensive line still standing, and within a few hours they managed to break it. The German 4th and 9th armies had to retreat, as they were in danger of being annihilated. On April 20th, the day Adolf Hitler turned 56, the final phase of this campaign was launched, called the Stettin-Rostock Offensive. Its goal was to continue to gain ground on Germany so that it would not fall into Western hands after the Nazi surrender. It was commanded by General Konstantin Rokossovsky and his 2nd Belarusian Front, which fought against the German 3rd Panzer Army. Rokossovsky was one of the most successful military men of the entire Second World War, having fought and won several of the most important victories, such as Kursk, Kyiv, and Warsaw. The outcome of this operation was no different. This offensive was carried out in conjunction with the beginning of the attack on Berlin, led by the Communist Marshal Zhukov, which began with a massive artillery barrage on the capital. Many civilians died in these first hours, but this was only the beginning. In the following days, The 4th and 9th Armies were cornered near Frankfurt. Although some managed to escape, most of the Nazi fighters were killed in the fighting or captured. Rokossovsky then advanced into northern Germany and encountered British forces, while Zhukov continued his attacks on the capital. The battle would continue for nearly 3 weeks. Hitler, desperate, ordered that all Berliners take up arms and join the defense of the city. Anyone who did not do so could be executed as a traitor. Many suffered this fate. Yet despite the sacrifice of Berliners, whether voluntary or forced, the battle was already lost. Nearly 2.5 million Soviets faced 800,000 poorly equipped, battered, and demoralized Germans. Urban combat was brutal, but it was something the Red Army specialized in, unlike the German forces who preferred open battle. Defensive encirclements fell one after another as Stalin's men and women came ever closer to the bunker where Hitler was holed up.
As the Soviets break into the buildings and start attacking the German defenders there, they're also encountering German civilians who are getting killed and slaughtered in the fighting just as badly as the soldiers. It's an ungodly and awful, horrifically nasty battle.
On April 30th, with all hope gone, the Führer decided to take his own life along with his wife, Eva Braun. Joseph Goebbels, his propaganda minister, and his wife followed suit the next day after poisoning their 6 children. Before committing suicide, they left orders for the remaining generals not to surrender under any circumstances and to fight to the death. But with the most fanatical Nazis out of the picture, these officers saw no reason to continue fighting a battle that could not be won. On May 8th, they signed the unconditional surrender of Germany's forces. The war in Europe was finally over. The victory at Seelow and its surroundings, while it may pale in comparison to the brutal fighting in Berlin, also resulted in an enormous number of deaths. Around 100,000 men, including the last experienced German units, were annihilated in just a few weeks. The Oder-Neisse Offensive undoubtedly sealed the fate of the Third Reich and was what led to its destruction and the fall of Hitler.
Casi
Almost
6
6 million
millones
deaths,
de muertes.
rape and crime everywhere, blood flowing in torrents in the cold trenches of Russia. Clearly, Operation Barbarossa and the subsequent clash on the Eastern Front were the backdrop of the wildest scenes of World War II. When Hitler decided to invade the nation led by Joseph Stalin, he anticipated a quick and easy victory, but encountered a real hell that ended up consuming countless soldiers' lives. In this edition of Military History, we want to present this turning point in full color, as you've never seen it before, giving it a new dimension. Prepare to experience the conflict firsthand. Amongst the land, fire, blood, and fear. Let's begin this impactful presentation. The relationship between the Third Reich and the Soviet Union was a decisive factor in the development of World War II. In the 2 years leading up to Operation Barbarossa, both countries had signed political and economic pacts for strategic purposes. Despite the vast ideological distance and Hitler's declared intentions to expand eastward, in 1939 they formalized the well-known Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, named after the foreign ministers of each nation. In this document, Germany secured the neutrality of the Soviet Union in exchange for ceding half of Poland, Bessarabia, and the Baltic states. Additionally, the Soviet Union claimed control of the Dardanelles Strait, Finland, and the possibility of opening bases in Denmark. Essentially, Eastern Europe was divided between Moscow and Berlin.
Steadily, his armies were redeployed to the east and re-equipped for what would be their greatest challenge.
The Soviet advance in the Baltic led to a strain on the neutrality agreement by threatening, from the German perspective, the supply of iron from Sweden and nickel from Finland. Although the Soviet Union had generally adhered to the treaty, particularly in sending raw materials to the Third Reich, Soviet territorial ambitions unsettled Hitler. By the end of May 1940, there were discussions in Berlin about the possibility of launching an attack against the Soviet Union by July 1941. The Führer assigned the task of planning the invasion to Franz Halder, who in turn delegated the mission to Erich Marx. However, until the last moment, Adolf Hitler tried to exhaust the diplomatic route to draw Joseph Stalin into the German sphere. In July 1940, after the Soviet occupation of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, the German High Command began planning the attack. This was the birth of Operation Barbarossa, named in honor of Emperor Frederick III. The Third Reich needed to divide its forces and avoid repeating Napoleon Bonaparte's mistake of invading such an extensive country with a single block of soldiers. Various aerial reconnaissance missions were also carried out along the German-Soviet border to understand exactly what they would be facing. Erich Marx's plan envisioned the formation of two large army groups advancing from Poland towards Moscow and Kiev. However, this was not the only strategy. There was also the idea of deploying three armies, targeting Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev for destruction. From December 3rd to 7th, a Kriegspiel war game was staged to determine which plan would be executed. The second option was ultimately chosen. Incredibly, British intelligence had warned the Soviet Union of the imminent invasion, but Stalin believed it was a desperate attempt by Churchill to pull him into the war alongside the Allies. Even though Soviet spy Richard Sorge provided Moscow with the exact date of the attack, the advance took the Red Army by surprise. The Stavka, the High Command, had not issued any preventive war measures. Joseph Stalin had no doubt that a German-Soviet conflict was inevitable, but he believed that Hitler would not open a second front before finishing the war with Britain. Clearly, the Russian leader overestimated the Führer's patience. Let's return to what was happening on the German front in the weeks leading up to the start of Operation Barbarossa.
As German soldiers now flooded into neighboring Poland, Stalin, desperate to maintain the peace, gave orders that nothing should be done to offend Hitler.
Germany needed millions of soldiers to overcome the powerful Soviet defense. The mobilization of citizens for the armed forces, known as the Wehrmacht, was so massive that it caused a shortage of labor in the country. This recruitment increased the number of troops, but overall worsened the quality of the army, as not everyone had the necessary training. Worse still, much of the weaponry and equipment provided came from the spoils of previous campaigns. They were outdated platforms that had already been worn down by combat use. In summary, the infantry forces that began the attack on the Soviet Union were no better than those used in previous battles against the West. But that didn't matter. The German army was driven by imperial ambition and a renewed patriotic sentiment, combined with hatred towards the Slavic peoples. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the border to invade the socialist giant, led by Joseph Stalin. There was no declaration of war. It was a direct stab at the heart of Moscow with the intention of ending its power once and for all. Since that June day, Eastern Europe became the stage for some of the bloodiest and most savage battles of World War II, with numerous crimes that horrified the world for years. The coordination between the Wehrmacht's ground and air forces allowed the Germans to quickly defeat the surprised Soviet border garrisons. In less than 24 hours, the Germans managed to advance between 10 and 60 kilometers. In contrast, the Soviet units were poorly coordinated, primarily due to the oversized Red Army, the lack of competent officers, and delays in political response. It was clear that the Third Reich began Operation Barbarossa with a winning hand. But to be victorious, much bloodshed still lay ahead. The Soviet defensive plans were still heavily influenced by the experience of World War I, with all their units spread evenly along the border and very close to it. One of the problems with adopting a defensive position is being able to halt the breakthrough at the point where the attacker can concentrate all their forces. There were no reserve troops in the rear to quickly close the gaps in the front, allowing the Germans to penetrate at full speed once the invasion began. In the following months, the international map of the conflict was reorganized. The Allied and satellite countries of the Third Reich declared war on or severed ties with the Soviet Union. Italy and Romania did so immediately on June 22nd. Within a few days, Slovakia, Finland, Hungary, and Vichy France joined the list of Moscow's enemies. But not all news was bad for Joseph Stalin. The governments of the United Kingdom and the United States declared their support for the Soviet Union. Thus, the final map was formed, pitting the axis of the Third Reich against the Allies.
Hitler's panzers were soon thrusting deep into Soviet territory. Within 2 days, the panzers had penetrated more than 50 miles. Ill-coordinated Red Army counterattacks were swiftly brushed aside.
In the first 5 weeks, the Soviet army lost approximately 1 million soldiers between the regions of the Bug River and the city of Smolensk. Many units were trapped and encircled between the German columns, and soon, with no supplies or communication, they opted to surrender, unaware that their fate lay in the infamous concentration camps. Russian tanks quickly exhausted their supply of armor-piercing ammunition and were powerless to halt the German panzers. However, during Operation Barbarossa, there were no significant clashes between enemy vehicles, as the German divisions were ordered to advance at full speed. This terrifying situation caused panic among the Soviet civilian population, but Moscow's soldiers were unwilling to be subdued by an invading force. Historically, one of the strongest links within the Russian army has been its numerous and tenacious infantry. During Operation Barbarossa, it was the foot soldiers who bore the brunt of the Third Reich's assault. In the first 3 months of the German offensive, the USSR lost over 100 rifle divisions. Many of these soldiers were from the last draft of the spring and had little training. The basic weapon of these troops was the Mosin Nagant 1890-1930 bolt-action rifle, chambered in 7.62 millimeters. It was a robust and accurate platform, complemented by the semi-automatic SVT-40 rifle, also in 7.62 millimeters. With these two weapons, tens of thousands of Germans were brought down while the country organized its defense with powerful state-of-the-art armaments. The introduction of the T-34 was crucial in stopping the advance of the panzers. The Soviet defensive buildup ran parallel to some truly negative symptoms within the Third Reich. The German military industry struggled to supply the troops at a good pace for such a large-scale undertaking. Researcher Martin Kitchen, citing a 1945 article, notes that after the fall of France, the German ruling class entertained the idea that the war was practically over and that the campaign in the East would be very brief. For this reason, no long-term plans were made. According to the article, by December 1941, Germany was producing 30% less armament than the previous year. In contrast, their communist enemy continued to build rifles, artillery pieces, and armored vehicles without pause. From the start of the offensive, some of the most savage crimes of the entire conflict were recorded, extending beyond the battlefield. The Germans considered Slavs to be an inferior race that needed to be exterminated. Additionally, Russian women were sexually abused by German troops, who viewed and execution as a right acquired by the powerful Third Reich. Each conquered town was subsequently destroyed, leaving no trace that people had ever lived there. At the same time, famine campaigns were carried out, destroying food supplies for the Russian populations. The goal was to eliminate them from the face of the earth, subjecting them to the worst of miseries. Due to these macabre aspects, some historians consider Operation Barbarossa an attempt to annihilate the entire Soviet people. After a brief illness that kept Hitler away from meetings with the Army General Staff, an internal crisis erupted within the Third Reich. Contrary to what his generals advised, the Führer did not consider capturing Moscow a priority for dominating the Soviet Union. On August 18th, a group of advisors tried to persuade Hitler to resume the offensive against the capital. They needed to act immediately, as the soldiers were unprepared for the harsh winter, which begins at that latitude 5 weeks earlier than in Ukraine. They believed that concentrating troops would enable them to finally capture Moscow. Hitler, however, countered that the panzer divisions were advancing too far from the infantry and were ineffective at encircling the enemy, who frequently managed to escape from the encircling maneuvers. To settle the matter, Hitler issued Directive No. 34, ordering a halt to the advance on Moscow and transitioning to a defensive posture, holding the ground already conquered. This mistake proved fatal for millions of soldiers. As time passed, the German offensive line became increasingly dispersed, diluting the effective power of their troops. Despite the initial impact and the significant victories achieved in the first month of Operation Barbarossa, Soviet morale had recovered, and by August, there were signs of a significant strategic improvement. The defensive positions established from Moscow were becoming increasingly effective in delaying the advance of the Third Reich. At the same time, the difficulty in delivering supplies to the front lines endangered millions of Germans who lacked the food and ammunition necessary to continue advancing. This attrition process intensified over the weeks as the young Germans ventured into a country they did not know and had completely underestimated. However, one of the worst enemies of the Third Reich was not found in the military halls of Moscow. It was something much more raw and unstoppable.
But the real obstacle to German advance would be the weather. On October the 8th, heavy rains set in. German vehicles soon became bogged down in a sea of mud.
With the autumn cold, the German supply lines were completely broken, with tens of thousands of soldiers, their horses, and their vehicles trapped in remote areas. The ground gradually began to be covered with snow, and nights became a torment for anyone without blankets or thick clothing to endure the low temperatures. As the weeks went by, conditions worsened for Hitler's men. The brutal Russian winter arrived, rendering a portion of the German armament unusable. The Führer had expected the offensive to be a matter of weeks and had not anticipated the need for special equipment for the cold. Another advantage was that Soviet soldiers were prepared to survive the Siberian temperatures. Delayed in their objectives and with the harsh Russian winter settling in, the German troops and their allies took Kiev and besieged Leningrad. But a Soviet counteroffensive halted them 80 kilometers from Moscow and nearly caused the collapse of the invading armies. The failure of Barbarossa sealed the fate of the Third Reich. The German forces achieved significant victories, occupied some key economic areas of the Soviet Union, and inflicted numerous casualties on the Red Army. Despite these early successes, the German offensive stalled at the Battle of Moscow in late 1941, and the subsequent Soviet counteroffensive pushed them back about 250 kilometers. The Germans had expected a rapid collapse of their enemy, as had occurred during the invasion of Poland, but the Russians were able to withstand the heaviest blows from the German Wehrmacht. The conflict thus bogged down into a war of attrition, for which the Germans were not prepared. After this defeat, the weakened forces of the Third Reich were no longer able to conduct major attacks along the entire Eastern Front. Subsequent offensives to regain the initiative and penetrate deep into Soviet territory, such as Operation Blue in 1942 and Operation Citadel in 1943, ultimately failed, resulting in the retreat and final collapse of Berlin's army. Of course, the effects were not only political. The brutality of these battles was reflected in an unprecedented death toll. Combining both fronts, approximately 5,600,000 people, both civilians and military personnel, died. It was a bloodbath that affected the demographics of the warring parties and shaped the course of the war until its conclusion in 1945. The Jewish population in territories belonging to the Soviet Union also suffered a severe blow. The German special troops, known as Einsatzgruppen, were ordered to annihilate them, and they did so. Nearly 2.5 million Jews were murdered in pogroms, executions, or by being sent to concentration camps. This figure is brutal. Considering the total number of Jewish deaths was 6 million, this means that around 40% resulted from Operation Barbarossa. The importance of this offensive in the final outcome of World War II is still debated today. For many, Hitler was naive to think he could invade the Soviet Union in record time, not only underestimating its organizational capability and fierce army, but also the relentless climate. Others argue that the problem was not the attack itself, but the delay in invading the socialist neighbor. By 1941, Stalin's government was in the midst of modernization and already had the means to repel the enemy. Perhaps in 1939, the story might have been different. And you, what do you think? Was this operation the turning point of World War II? Leave your answer in the comments box. This concludes our video. If you're interested in discovering the most brutal events of the 20th century, in full color and with rich detail, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications for our channel. This way, you'll have access to all our updates. Until the next installment of Military History, thank you for joining us.